I have a quick, I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a comment for the question of the power, and this is inspired by my reading of Aureli's book, which I really enjoyed quite a bit. What's very interesting in the beginning, he is describing the subject, how the subject first emancipates itself, becomes autonomous of the forces of nature, and then there's this feeling that the subject is further receiving autonomy because of the project of rationality and also the management of technology, which I think goes a little bit towards your suggestion of the management of big data. And then at the end, though, what is realized is that in his case, it's in the 60s in Italy, that the project of the factory has essentially extended in the everyday life, that the logic of factory is what our every life is about. And Heidegger would also write about the Gestell, that we are all ordered in the Gestell. The question then is, as we are all ordered into the power structures and we can't escape them anyways, what is then the possibility for becoming autonomous within that situation? And I think, so there were two models then discussed. I mean, Heidegger thinks in the perversion of the systematicity is a poetic opening in a way. You could say that Archizoom projects, in a way, further pervert, and that's also, of course, a discussion Aurelie brings to the table, further pervert the system's characteristics to such a degree that they become so radicalized that they again have a poetic or some sort of opening. And the other version would be the Rossi version, where Rossi goes into the urban fabric and creates within the homogeneous space, the heterogeneous space, he creates place. And that being the kind of autonomous positioning of it. Of course, this all is still within the power regime of capitalism, and yet it's maybe enabling a kind of commentary on it. I just wanted to bring that to attention. I think I was amazed by these two options, and I think those projects are really powerful projects, and I think are still of relevance today.
Alejandro, I would like very much to reply. First of all, I believe that architecture is weak media, and if we are in a system of power, it is the existence of the overweening existence of media today providing so much information that we can't deal with it. And architecture, I don't think, competes with media, number one. Number two, I would argue that autonomy, as is a political gesture, is in a sense a resistance to, if it is the power of the popular power of media, of whatever is moving politically. And I would think autonomy always is a political act, number one. If we get to what you're talking about in terms of power, I would argue that, again, it's a value judgment as to what constitutes the possibility of architectural power. You signified in your discussion that it could be scripting. And I would argue that a person who graduates from Princeton, and there were 6 or 7 in the thesis last year who did scripts, as it were, as a thesis project or part of a thesis project, I would say they are incapable of the power of scripting because they have no discipline. And it would seem to me that without discipline, the scripting is an irrelevant procedure because they're not scripting architecture or not giving the possibility of the power to architecture. So to me, the responsibility of pedagogy is to enact discipline. Discipline, for me, is power. It is the only power that an architect has. And then if they need the means to insert that discipline into society, they can learn to script. But without the disciplinary underpinning, there's no value for me in scripting, and therefore no power. And I would like to hear your reply to that, because It may be obvious that Aldo Rossi's work is political, but I would also argue the work of Autonomy is very much political, and could be even more so than the Rossi model.
I heard the three of you very clearly and distinctly. I'm very sorry, I am not going to be able to refer to Inge's presentation, but I think there is already a few things that I can reply to. You know, first of all, I don't think that you can so easily distinguish media and architecture as two separate milieus. I think that they are intrinsically connected now, as we all know, and I think that some of the most interesting agencies of architects today rely precisely on the possibility of relating with these media that are becoming all-encompassing and all-pervading. I think that my concern with what you are stating now, which is that it's only through, well, maybe you didn't say it's only through autonomy, but you did say that autonomy is a political act, and is in some ways you gave autonomy the main role in playing or enabling or enacting a political agency in architecture. I think that the problem of that is the very definition of that discipline, and I think this is where we are heading to a difficult territory, when our the basis of the discipline are grounded on the history of architecture, when rather than looking around and seeing in what way we can pervade media, or we can exert agency within this growing parallel and related fields. We keep referring to the autonomy of the discipline as the ground for the power of the architect. I would completely disagree with your statement that somebody who graduates with a project that is about scripting is not a real possibility for architects today. In fact, I think it's one of the most interesting possibilities that architects can play. And I mean, I can think of a number of ways in which somebody playing with scripts could have an incredible effect on the discipline. I think that one of the key things that we need to consider is where does I mean, in the presentation of Gabriele, he was making kind of continuum between architecture and other arts, but I think that if there is something that is specific of architecture in respect to other arts, is precisely the fact that it's more entangled with power than any other art. So you can be a painter, or you can be a musician, and the amount of means that you need to mobilize in order to practice your discipline is infinitely smaller than the one that you have to use when you are practicing as an architect. And therefore, I think that this idea of the autonomy is very difficult to define, because I mean, the only argument that you can construct will be a historically constructed argument, which is primarily based on the perception of architecture as an art. And I'm not sure that the typical vehicles of the history of art are adequate to address the questions that we are facing when we do a building. For example, the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed at a certain point triggered a huge amount of rain screens made out of titanium. Is that relevant to the discipline and to the history of architecture? I think it is, but if you look at the way architecture is described, probably the fact that titanium was used in certain buildings is not something that has become part of the judgment or of that piece of work. I'm talking obviously about the Guggenheim Museum, but you can look at that effect of geopolitical power on the use of material as one of the crucial facts that have occurred in the discipline in recent years. Therefore, I think unless we are able to address media and to address geopolitics and to consider them and integrate them in our disciplinary considerations, we are going to remain unable to exert any form of resistance.
Alejandro, what is the difference, in other words, forget resistance for a minute. Architect X works for a developer, produces a 100-story building without what we would say is a critical act, because the architect in question doesn't understand what a critical act is, and the developer doesn't need a critical act. And so the 100-story building gets built, and where are we? In other words, it seems to me that what you're talking about is the power structure doesn't need the act of architecture, nor the art of architecture, nor the disciplinary resistance that could be had. In fact, no client wants disciplinary resistance. And so therefore, if it's not built in to the educational, the pedagogy, whether you call it history or art or culture or philosophy, if it's not built in, then all the architect does is respond to what the client wants, produces 100-story buildings, and there we are. And it would seem to me that's not where you are. That's not your condition of either teaching or building yourself.
No, I completely agree that that's not where we want to be, but I think that we need to redefine what the discipline is in order to be able to be effective. When a developer asks you to build a 100-story tower, I think that is and I think that there are many other factors that are involved in the making of a 100-story tower that are not being told in the history of the discipline. This is I think the problem, and therefore there are very few tools that we are being able to teach in architecture schools that will allow people to position themselves and exert judgment in that situation.
I think that's true, Alejandro. I agree that the titanium example is a good one, but I think that if you don't frame it in terms of what impact that the choice of that titanium or the availability of that titanium might have on a cultural artifact as it's created, I think then you're not offering. It becomes purely a question of number crunching. So I think where you make a mistake is saying that the project of autonomy is purely tied to the historical construct of the discipline. I think that it's in fact tied to the cultural impact of architecture. And so I don't think that, I mean, I wouldn't really believe that you're advocating bean counterism. But I think you're offering a sort of extreme example to pull autonomy away from a definition that you think it's stuck in. I would say I'm not sure that it's quite that stuck.
Sorry, I couldn't hear very well the last thing you said.
The last thing I said was that I don't really believe that you're advocating bean counterism. That I think that you really, I think you're exaggerating the definition of autonomy to make your point, and I think your point is a good one in terms of where interdisciplinarity has to be something that's linked to the discipline. But I think that you have to be careful not to reduce the argument of autonomy to a historical project.
But so, how do you delimit the autonomy of the discipline if it is not by reference to a historical construction?
It's the cultural impact of architecture. It's a cultural impact. It's a cultural discourse. That's not pure history.
But then by definition you need to go much broader than to the books of history of architecture.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I don't think you have disagreement on that point, but I think that you have to ascertain cultural value of a project, and that's not just through numbers.
No. I mean, obviously, projects have cultural values, and I think that the problem we are suffering today is that we are unable to pervade culture because sometimes we are too obfuscated with looking at what does it mean in terms what we are doing means in terms of the history of architecture.
No, but you're only defining culture as history. Alejandro, you know there's a crisis in the university in general in the United States that they're becoming glorified trade schools because nobody is studying cultural products. And that goes for architecture. I have this terrible feeling that we're turning out people that know Revit and BIM and those kinds of systems and can program and write scripts and have no cultural heritage whatsoever. They don't read Proust, they don't read Faulkner, they don't read anything but technical journals. And for me, the situation in architecture is mirrored across the university, and you've seen it, and you are in one of the most cultural institutions. To suggest that it doesn't function in terms of the products that it's producing is one of the problems, I think. I don't disagree at all that we have to redefine what it means to be disciplinary and it broaden. But we're not talking, none of us here are talking history for sure. And no, we're not asking historians, as some of your faculty are, exclusively, to be the ones that initiate this discourse. None of us here are historians, we're all architects.
Yeah, actually, in this group, yes, I understand that there are some historians there too. But I mean, leaving aside obviously, I agree with you that an architecture school should not be a glorified trade school, and I don't think that the bean counting should be the preeminent duty or remit of an architectural school today. Obviously, we need to aim to have cultural significance, but I think that the main problem we are having is that cultural significance is moving very quickly away from the conventional domains of architecture, and I mean it's cultural, but it's also political, because the dramatic situation of architects is that more than any other artistic discipline, we are ideated by a practice that is intrinsically linked to power, and I think that I keep coming back to the question of power, because I think that is crucial to the discussion. How are we able to affect structures that are outside the traditional discipline of architecture? This is a very deep cultural problem that we are facing. And obviously, I'm not saying we need to be a glorified trade school, but we need to get into some of those processes in order to be able to be relevant in our practices and in the redefinition, and therefore in the redefinition of our discipline.
And of course, it all depends on what you mean by relevant, Alejandro. We would all say, yes, we want to be relevant, but is relevant an aspect of resistance? I don't know.
I'm sorry, we have to interrupt this discussion just to check whether there are some questions in the audience, and then maybe we can combine. Sorry.
You can answer in a bit.
Yeah.
Let him answer.
Okay.
Yeah. You should hear what the question
No, I'd like Alejandro to answer whether he thinks architecture should.
No, unfortunately, when the noise comes from the room, I cannot.
Okay, so someone up there can ask for
No, ask the question.
Inga, ask him this.
Yeah.
Should architecture in any way be resistant? What does he want architecture to do? What change does he want to affect? What does he want it to do?
Alejandro, the question is, should architecture resist at all? What do you want architecture to do? What should be the effect of architecture?
Or is
I
resistance part of
definitely
relevance?
think that architecture should resist. I mean, that's precisely what it means to be relevant, not to be simply an enabler of power, but that.
Okay, any thoughts how? How could it resist?
Be organized.
I mean, I think we're all wondering that right now.
Sorry. Well, are you hearing me?
I hear you. You can't see me
Yeah.
because I turned you around a little bit, so I
Yeah.
I can turn you back on. Okay, so question
No.
is,
Well, but that's it. That obviously, resistance is one of our duties, and I would like to, one of the problems we have is that in the charter of the definition of what is to be an architect, there used to be a notion of public service. So architects were not simply defined as people who were enabling their clients, that means the people that were paying their fees, to dictate what they did. Architecture had a certain public stance that at this very moment seemed to have been entirely lost. This is also something that has happened, for example, to bankers.
So you suggest then if we become public servants in some fashion, that we then could maybe corrupt the system from within?
That I think that architecture needs to retrieve a certain sense of service, not to the clients, but to a kind of wider public. I've been reminded recently that there is a number of business schools that have started to make a Hippocratic oath, and I think that this is something that perhaps architects should start to consider, which is that we are not simply working for clients and in our free time discussing amongst us how what we do fits into the history of architecture, but we need to start to think again that unless we rebuild our professional stance vis-a-vis the public good, however silly this may sound, we are lost. Nobody believes that we can do anything other than be enablers for our clients and speak in a very strange language amongst ourselves.
But I wonder whether the talk.
I cannot hear you. Can you condense your question so I can
Okay,
repeat
I
it
can't
from
hear.
the-
He's coming over.
Maybe somebody else in the table can answer to the questions.
Okay. No, the question
We
for
forgot
me.
to mention that when we started Skyping with you.
No, you don't need, we have another respondent.
Shall I-
Come here.
Just hurry up.
Here.
because we really have to
We'll be all right.
have our next.
A few minutes late, it's okay.
And I think the message will not be
Go ahead, you have to
Yeah.
come closer.
Okay. I think the discussion was very interesting and brought up a lot of interesting topics. But my question is whether the term autonomy is the right to discuss, whether we shouldn't replace it by the term sovereignty. So architecture is a sovereign practice, because this means something for architecture, because then if we talk about corrupting the system, about resistance and these kind of things, a little bit it sounds to me like whether we talk about a kind of inferiority complex of architecture towards society. But isn't it the question how we make the discipline a sovereign discipline, which is on the same time above things and at the same time within things, just the concept of sovereignty. It seems to me that we get more out of it for the discipline if we talk about the concept of sovereignty instead of autonomy. Sovereignty.
Sovereignty, not serenity.
No, not sovereignty.
I like very much that distinction, and I would like to ask Peter that question, which is,
I have no problem.
which is no, I mean, because I believe that particularly I thought that Sarah pointed at the question of judgment, and maybe sovereignty is another way of talking about that. But is the tool for architecture to be sovereign, to be autonomous? I don't think so, and so that's, I think, probably the difference between what Peter says and.
No, but I don't think you believe in sovereignty either. That's the problem.
Why? Why do you think so?
That would go on another half an hour. We get it on Thursday in
And I'm
New York.
sorry, but we don't have another half an hour.
I was sent here.
Yeah.
The Hippocratic Oath is taken. The first people who took the Hippocratic Oath are the doctors, the medical doctors.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that nobody would ever question that medical doctors are in the service of the public. You wouldn't want your doctor to start talking about the opera when you go and want to find out if the rash is going to kill you or not. And it seems to me that the opposition between public service and taking the discipline seriously, I don't see an opposition. What do you do if you don't speak on behalf of your discipline? Then you don't have an expertise, then how can you be of service to anybody? So the deontology of architects is, in fact, to insist that a discipline exists, because otherwise we get so crushed by the big business that you are talking about.
No. And who decides what is the discipline? Because I think that the only form I know in which the discipline can be defined is as a kind of historical construction, and I think that's where we are starting to miss the most relevant forms of power that we that we see today affecting the world and architecture at large.
The audience believes that the power should be with the architects to define what the discipline is that right? Yes. Okay, did you get that? What's wrong with that, Scott Cohen asked.
That I don't know how Scott defines architecture, and I suspect that he defines architecture based on some sort of historical construction.
How do you define architecture, Scott?
So how do
Scott doesn't know anything about history, that's for sure.
Okay, before we continue, we really have to close this session. I'm sure you will discuss that later.
Alejandro will continue on Thursday. by Skype.
Okay, I'll give you a
Thank
call.
you once again for participating.
Yeah.
So now we have a 5-minute break.